Well, welcome back, everybody. Today we are starting a new chapter, um, chapter 8, called Reforming America. And reforming, of course, to reform means to change. So, one of the elements of Jacksonian democracy that we talked about in the previous chapter, recall that Jacksonian democracy was this concept of democracy expanding, of democracy being more inclusive, of the country reforming to include more people, to be more democratic, to more fulfill that promise of representing the people and providing voting rights and those sorts of things. And that does show up in a lot of political reforms, like expansion of voting rights, like changes in the way that parties nominated their candidates for office and things like the spoil system. But it also shows up somewhat in some social reforms of that era as well, which actually extend well beyond the Jackson era. So this is also a time where a lot of individuals, groups, societies, and organizations were looking and reflecting upon American society and finding things that they didn't like about it, and then working together to try to fix those problems or try to reform those things. And many of these are political in nature, political reforms that were designed to, again, make the country more democratic, to more fulfill its promises of a government that truly represents the people and all of that. We can see absolute politics in some of these. Many of them are social, trying to fix society's ills, whether they are trying to create a more moral society, a more fair society, a more godly society in some ways, but trying to make society work better and trying to fulfill ultimately this American vision of a society that works well for everyone, of a more democratic society, whether you're looking at that through a political or a socioeconomic lens. So today we're going to look at the basis for a lot of these reforms, as many of them are not exactly religious reforms, but many of them are inspired by religion. So religious expectation, religious conviction is what is going to lead to a lot of these reform movements that we'll be talking about throughout this particular section. Some of them not so much, but a lot of them are directly inspired. So today we're going to begin by looking at the movement that becomes the catalyst for all of this reform. And if you have studied your chemistry, you know a catalyst is something that starts a reaction, that gets it moving. And that was very much a religious movement, and one that we have seen something like this happen before. So, you may recall in the colonial era that we saw a Great Awakening, the Great Awakening, or what I even mentioned then is sometimes referred to as the First Great Awakening, because there is a second one that occurs later, and that's what we're looking at now. We are going to see starting to spread throughout the United States in the 1830s and moving into the 1840s, even another religious revival, a second Great Awakening. So, another massive try attempt to sort of re-energize people's religious faith. Another massive wave of this evangelical religion of trying to encourage people to renew their faith, to renew their commitment to their faith, and to show their faith in some kind of a way. And so it is essentially kind of the same thing, and it's caused by similar things. It is once again caused by there were some ideas that were gaining ground prior to this that, and you don't necessarily need to know these, but things like deism that sort of challenged like the divinity of Jesus, that seemed to be more secular. And was a seeming decline as the country spread out and people moved west. People were living out in more rural areas, not in towns, and perhaps not where there were churches close by. So there was a concern, just like in the First Great Awakening, that we had, or that people had fallen away from religion, and that was dangerous. And we were just sort of going down the wrong path. Everything just seemed to be moving towards secularization, and secular means non-religious. And so that creates a stage for a new religious revival to come roaring in. So they are similar in that sense. But one thing that is remarkably different about the Second Great Awakening is that it is actually bigger. This is a much larger religious revival than we saw the first time. And that's saying something, because the first one was pretty big and affected, at that time, colonies all the way from New England to the South. And this one is going to be affecting people all over the United States as well. It will have really two centers of activity, both in intellectual centers and colleges, elite New England colleges like Harvard and Yale, which is more similar to what you had in the First Great Awakening. But another big area where the Second Great Awakening was happening, where it was really affecting people, was out in the frontier in rural America. And it was, that makes sense, because part of the thing that leads to this was the concern that because we're moving out into the frontier and because we're moving into these rural areas, people are disconnected from faith and disconnected from churches and all of that. So we have this massive religious revival and these big open air meetings. So some of it is in churches, like kind of like with the First Great Awakening, but also like with the First Great Awakening, some of the big impact of the message comes from these big open air meetings, like the one that's pictured here, with hundreds and hundreds of people coming from miles and miles around to come to these big spaces to listen to multiple preachers, some of whom were well known itinerant preachers that traveled around on these preaching circuits, sending their messages and trying to convert believers and convert followers. But another thing that we need to, sorry, I got ahead of myself. Your causes were those concerns about falling away from religion and all of that, if you need to go back. The message of the Second Great Awakening is somewhat similar to the first, but a little bit more specific in some things. A big message of the First Great Awakening that is common throughout most Great Awakening preachers, messages, sermons, and so on, is that salvation is available to anyone. And that's similar to the first one. The whole idea that salvation is not for a select few, but in this case, it is. In the First Great Awakening, that was more of a critique or a change on the whole predestination idea. This one is more an emphasis on anyone is able to gain salvation, even the worst of sinners. That even people who have done terrible things, even people that society has pushed aside, even people that, whether you are rich or poor, whether you are male or female, whether you are free or a slave, your social status, whether you're in prison, whether you have done terrible things, that anybody is capable of attaining salvation, and that no one and nothing is beyond redemption. And that becomes sort of a really important conviction that a lot of people have, that's going to influence some of these reform movements that we're going to talk about in a moment. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. So it is this message that all can obtain salvation, that anything and everything can be saved, that nothing is beyond that point where it can't be saved or it can't be changed. And that even the worst of sinners and the most, in the most darkness, that light could be found and that salvation could be found. And so people that were convicted by the Second Great Awakening have this, overall vision, an idea that nothing's beyond fixing, that everything can be fixed in some sort of a way. So as results of the Second Great Awakening. Actually, let me go back a second. Let me talk once again about the message. Another thing about the message of the Second Great Awakening, or something that it emphasizes. The Second Great Awakening emphasizes action. It emphasizes and it stresses a very active faith, that you have to go out and do, that it is not just enough to believe, that you had to go out and do. So it emphasizes spreading that faith and demonstrating that faith, not necessarily just by evangelizing or sending that message to other people. I have, sacraments and rituals and some of those sorts of things. And that, no hierarchy. And that oftentimes appealed to people that were out on the frontier, that were more simple and didn't, want that whole, were more evangelical. So, much more religious conversion, more churches, things like that. But again, the biggest thing, and we'll even see whole new religions actually come out of this. The Mormons, for example, are a whole new religious denomination unique to the United States that's a direct result of the Second Great Awakening. And you'll read a little bit about the Mormons in your reading. But another big effect of this is reform movements. This is going to result in a big wave of reform movements throughout the country. What we'll be looking at really for the rest of this chapter, the Second Great Awakening is the catalyst for that. Because as I was saying a moment ago, these brings people, one, encouraged to be active in their faith, encouraged to get out in their communities and fix the problems that they saw. They are very, very deeply religiously convicted to fix the things in their society that they saw as sinful, that they saw as wrong, that they saw as ungodly, that they saw as unchristian, and to try to change that, whether that was reforming the whole system, whether that was trying to encourage people to change their behavior and stop doing certain things like drinking, for example, and to make a better, more Christian, and in their minds, more democratic. They saw a direct connection to that, a more democratic society. And so there's so many people that do what they do in this age of reform, that attack whatever problem they attack or try to fix whatever issue that they see, whether it's slavery or, again, the movement to get people to stop drinking, or some of these social utopias that we're going to talk about in a few moments. A lot of those people, certainly not all of them, but a lot of them do that out of deep religious conviction, and people that believed that whatever it was society was doing, slavery is a great example, the belief that that was immoral, that that was wrong, that it was sinful, and that God would punish the United States for allowing something like slavery. And so we had to fix it. So it is very much inspired by the Second Great Awakening. And another thing that, way that that's inspired by the Second Great Awakening, as I was mentioning, one of the messages that was common here was that anybody and anything could be saved. And so these people also have this belief that, even something as terrible as slavery could be stopped, that even people that practice slavery could be saved, that they're even the worst of situations wasn't beyond redemption, that there was a way to fix it. So there is kind of an optimism that comes with it as well. Now, mostly what we'll be looking at in this chapter are people, that were trying to work within the system, trying to change some part of society, like ending slavery or including more rights for women or more public schools or things like that. But there are also those that actually, this is a extreme example, a minority of these reformers would be going to a greater extreme, and instead of trying to reform or change society, are rather attempting just to break away from it. There were those that believed that society couldn't be fixed as it was, and there were too many problems with it. And so the best thing to do would be to break away from it. And so one of the more fringe movements of this era and all these different movements were the social utopias. So social utopias, that word utopia you may recognize. Utopia means perfection. It means like a perfect society, a perfect community, an ideal society. Obviously not one that's very realistic, but the ideal society, an ideal community where, and that meant different things to different groups. It might mean a community in which there's no crime. It might mean, or oftentimes it meant things like that, or no poverty, or everybody is equal, total equality, things like that. This ideal kind of situation, a picture perfect kind of thing. And while these social utopias are pop up a lot in this era, they have a sort of a fad moment where there's all these different social utopias popping up. The idea of a perfect society really isn't new. In fact, it's really quite American. It's kind of as old as America itself. If you think about the Puritans and their attempt to come and establish the whole city on a hill, this perfect godly society that would be an example for the rest of the world, that was kind of a utopia they were trying to create. And that's the same thing some of these social utopian reformers have in mind as well, is that we'll break away from society, create our own community, and eventually we will inspire others to do the same thing. Everybody will want to be like us, and so we will inspire them. But so it's not an old thing, but in this era, they really have a moment, as we like to say today, as there more than 100 of them come and go, spring up within this century. Some of them are really, really weird and crazy. Some of them are super extreme, and a lot of them don't last very long. They tend to be like a lot of fads. People might latch onto it quickly in the beginning, but as perfection is not something humans are very good at. We're not perfect people, and people eventually disagree. So most of them fizzle out within a couple of years, but there are still a number of them, and some of which do last longer. And this also wasn't just going on in the United States. It was also going on in Europe. So some of these were religiously based. I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. And one of them that actually is still around. There aren't very many of these, obviously, that lasted, but one that did. So just a few examples, like the Shakers, and they are one of the, actually are still around. There's not very many Shakers left, but they are still there. The Shakers among other things, believed in orderly communities, cleanliness, neatness, everything having a certain place. And they were certainly organized around more things like that. The Shakers, there's a style of furniture that you can still buy today called Shaker furniture, that everything's real utilitarian and has a place, and no wasted space, no wasted parts, kind of a thing. There's a style there. You might recognize the name Oneida. The Oneida community is another example that the organization did not last, but you may have seen that name if you've been shopping in the like houseware section. There's a brand of silverware that's called Oneida, that's named for them because they made that originally. They made silverware. That wasn't what the utopia was started around, but that was just something that they did. So some of these are religiously based. There are some that are have religious beliefs, and they are a religious community, but a lot of them are economically based. For example, the picture that you see right up here, and this is an artist rendition, this wasn't an actual place. This was kind of the dream of one of the European communities. The idea that we will have this sort of even walled off kind of society and all that. Some of this was inspired by or a reaction to industrialization. The idea that industrialization was turning people into zombies, and that factory work was degrading and demeaning, and we needed to have a situation where people, everybody owned everything together, and there wasn't this gap between rich and poor. So communal living is common amongst the social utopias. Non-property ownership, saying that we all own the property together, that there is no rich, there is no poor, is common amongst the social utopias. But they all have kind of their own different weird beliefs. Some of them have, some of them are celibate, some of them are not. Some of them believe in, plural marriages, some don't. Some of them take converts, some don't. Some of them, they're just, some of them are really, really strange, and some of them, last longer than others because of that. But like I said, most of these don't have too much of an impact on the outside world because, again, it's just sort of hard to maintain these sorts of things. So a lot of them are not successful after a while, a few years. They either go bankrupt or there's a split in the community. Somebody starts thinking something different or something like that. So they are a much more extreme example. But still an example of another way that some groups tried to fix society was by just leaving it and trying to form something better. So we'll spend the rest of the time looking at those reformers like abolitionists and women's rights activists and others that sought to change society from within.